Hello, and welcome to the Faith Science Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the third Sunday of Easter for the week of May 4th, 2025, and I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig in this week's podcast, and may the 4th be with you. It's an amazing Sunday. It's one of the few nerdy jokes that I can throw out there for this week. But I think it's also just an exciting time. Like I stated last week, with being in the Easter season, it's just a fun time to be able to kind of dig into, after Jesus rose, what all happened. And we get this season of, then what are we supposed to do now? As we're living on this side of the cross, what does this all mean? And I think there's a lot of great things to be able to think about and look at and consider with that. And let's get back into last week's question, which was, have you ever seen the Thomas story as an experiment? I think that's where, in certain ways, especially coming from a more scientific perspective, I think we can acknowledge that and feel more comfortable with that. And I think that's where that story really does feel comforting. It feels like a warm blanket. And it is also one of these that, like we stated last week, it challenges you. It forces you to move forward. And I think that's part of what it's all supposed to be. There's a reason that John put it at the end of his gospel. I think it is one of these stories that motivates us to go forth and figure out what does that mean going forward. And I think that ties really well into where we'll be going this week, because I think that's kind of what Jesus is getting at. So let's just jump into it. The Old Testament text, which isn't from the Old Testament this week. The first reading is from Acts chapter 9, verses 1-6, and optionally 7-20. Like we stated, the next few weeks, the first reading is going to be out of Acts, and this is the story of Paul's conversion, baptism, and preaching. We have to remember initially that Paul was a persecutor of the early Christians, was very much of the old school Jewish faith, and was not about this Jesus guy. And while he is going out on the road bound for Jerusalem, he all of a sudden the heavens basically part open and flash him in the eyes. And he gets this voice of, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And he said, who are you, Lord? I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Get up and enter the city, and you will be told what to do. And he is blind from that moment. So they bring him into Damascus, and there is a disciple named Ananias. And Ananias responds to the Lord. The Lord says, go to the specific place, and there's this man called from Tarshish named Saul, and I need you to go and spend some time with him. He's been praying. And Ananias is a little bit concerned about this. I've heard about what he's done. I've heard how he's been really rough with these early Christians. And we get a response here from the Lord in verse 15. Go, for he is the instrument who I have chosen to bring my name before the Gentiles and kings and before the people of Israel. This idea then of God has a plan, so go forth and do it. Ananias follows and goes and appears, and in stating that through the Holy Spirit and through the Lord Jesus appearing to him, that then his sight is restored, and Saul becomes Paul and wants to go and be baptized. And after spending a few days with him, he begins his missionary field. This idea of how then Saul becomes Paul, this transformation that happens, and also then I'm being called into the mission field in an unexpected way. The psalm that goes with that this week is Psalm 30, all 12 verses of it. And this is one of those psalms that's recognizing the different ways that God continues to provide for us and is healing us through that. And there is references here on how we have been continued to be restored and giving thanks to God. Even in the moments of anger, we still have a God who doesn't give up on us. In the weeping, God still continues to be there. Your favor continues to be with your people, and recognizing that God will guide us through and is the helper for all of this, and will turn our mourning into dancing and turn our sackcloths into being clothed with joy. So So thus we sing praise to God, recognizing what God all does for us. The second reading is from Revelation this week, chapter 5, verses 11 to 14. And this is, again, further in John's telling of Revelation and how there are all these angels and creatures and elders in full voice singing to God and giving praise to God, that every creature on earth and on all of them are singing praise and the amen and worshiping God. And I think it's important here in this, especially with where we'll be going this week, recognizing that this is part of a choir, recognizing this is part of full voice, recognizing that this is everyone coming together to be part of this. And the reason I say that is if you've ever been a part of a choir, you recognize how important everybody is, the working together to be part of the whole, and that there are a lot of key people within that. The key person to you might be different than a key person to someone else, especially when you're standing next to similar people time after time. You start keying off of different voices to help make sure that you are in tune, to help make sure that you are in full chorus. The importance of everybody coming together and being part of that is important. The gospel text this week is out of John chapter 21, verses 1 to 19. We get to go backwards here in John from last week. And this is where Jesus now appears by the Sea of Tiberias. And the disciples, there's a couple of them, Simon Peter, Thomas the twin, Nathanael, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples, after seeing all this, have decided to go out fishing. And Jesus appears on the shore, and they don't recognize him. And so they're out fishing all night, and Jesus is there on the shore and sees them and says, "Have you had any luck tonight? No fish?" And states, "Cast your nets on the other side." And when they do, like before, there is a huge haul of fish to the point where the nets are nearly breaking, but they don't break. They have 153 fish that are caught. And they come in and they're having breakfast, and they fry the fish and have some bread and have breakfast. And then Jesus asks Peter 3 times, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus responds with, "Feed my lambs." "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Tend my sheep." "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter, at this point, is kind of sick of the question, feeling a little bit overwhelmed. "Why do you keep asking me?" "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus responds with, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and go wherever you wished. But as you grow old, you stretch out your hand and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." And this is then John getting into a little bit of theology, talking about how he was going to be glorified. And Jesus then is stating at the end to follow him. The recognition on how Jesus is saying to Simon, "Feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep." This recognition of all these different people and bringing them all together to recognize something much greater than themselves. But before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we do a shameless plug for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between the Sermon Brainwaves podcast, or commentaries, discussions, since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help me give some ideas for the podcast. And there's great back archives that allow for great discussion, great different commentaries of past years, ways to be thinking about these texts. And so if you haven't checked out that resource from workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, along with the art, prayers, hymns, colors, and daily devotions. This is such a great time of year to be looking through that art, looking at some of those different prayers, or making sure you've touched all the different hymns. But also, I think those daily devotions are a really great resource to be checking out. It's an amazing also going through these lectionary texts, how there's a lot of the different minor holidays and such that are also covered here on Vanderbilt's lectionary. So if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter covering a wide variety of ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies for the weekly preaching similar to this, along with the newsletter covering some additional events and different ecological ideas and things to be implementing into your own faith practice. So if you haven't checked that out, that'll be the first link down in the reference section for the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. Finally, if you're a high school student and you're looking for something really fun this summer, I'd highly recommend checking out the Gus Davis Faith, Science, and Ethics Camp, June 21st through 27th in St. Peter, Minnesota. It's an amazing camp where they'll be going through this year the sweet life, getting granular with sugar, and talking about how faith, science, and ethics are all working together. Having been part of this for the last couple of years, I'd highly recommend checking this camp out. I know that I have walked away with a lot of cool information and actually learning a lot. And they're really, really cool people down there. If you haven't checked this out and you're a high school student looking for something fun this summer, I'd highly recommend checking out the Gus Davis Faith, Science, and Ethics Camp, June 21st through the 27th. When we look at these texts, we see this theme that kind of comes up on how God is calling us into mission, how God is calling us into our particular task. We can see that definitely with Paul. I referenced it within the choir references in Revelation. We can see it here where Jesus says, yes, follow me, but also feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. Feed, tend, feed. And I think sometimes that can be hard to fully recognize of what is our calling, what is it that we are being called to do, and doing it, I think is a whole thing in and of itself. But I think we do have some interesting examples from nature themselves for us to be able to understand this in a different light. And so I am going to go into the interesting world of carnivorous plants. So carnivorous plants, typically, when you think about them, probably the first one that comes to mind is something like the Venus flytrap or a pitcher plant. These are plants that, because of the ecosystems that they are in, these plants typically are found in areas where the soil quality is poor or none, and that they're trying to figure out how to grow. And so they have, through evolution, evolved to be able to break down amino acids and be able to have some protein. And so thus being able to lure in a lot of these different, specifically with a lot of them, insects through using nectar instead of something to attract, but something to be as more of bait to lure them in, to trap them in some way. So as like a Venus flytrap to close in on them so that they can emit their stomach juices onto that fly or insect, or a pitcher plant where they're using the nectar as a lure in, and that if they land, the sides of the pitcher plant are extremely slippery and causing them to fall into their digestive juices, and being able to use that as a source to be able to grow. Now, there's other places that as you get more tropical, things get bigger and you have more competition. So when we go toward the equator, and if we find ourselves in Indonesia on Borneo, which is one of the biggest islands in the Southeast Pacific, we can find not one, but two of these different types of carnivorous plants. And I find them fascinating. Because first and foremost, just getting our heads around the idea, as we kind of talked about here, that these carnivorous plants have modified leaves. And how they have modified their leaves, they, yes, still get energy from photosynthesis, but not enough. So they've had to modify their leaves. And in this case, it's going to be two different types of pitcher plants to allow for them to be able to digest and eat these different critters, in quotes, because we'll talk about that a little bit differently than what you're expecting this time, to be able to then continue to grow. So the first one I want to bring up is talking about, they're both in the Nephales family, but the first one is the Raha. And this is a big pitcher plant on the ground, and there's a lot of nectar on its top leaf. And there's this wide gaping hole. And what we have found is there is mutualism, specifically with mountain tree shrews. So to rewind, remember, mutualism is an aspect of where something benefits both of them. So in this case, there is benefits to the mountain tree shrew and there is benefits to the Raha. What happens is the nectar that's on the top leaf is food for this mountain tree shrew. And what the pitcher plant is getting is its fecal matter. The fecal matter is a high, dense nitrogen source, which allows for these plants to be able to grow and be able to grow large and grow big. And it's vital for them in their growth, especially because they're suffering from not being able to get enough photosynthesis. So they have allowed for this large mutualistic relationship to happen. They see that there's also one with the summit rat. It's not as defined, and it seems as if that this relationship back and forth is kind of good because they have a little bit different times that these two different critters are going. And it seems like the plant really isn't wanting to kill the actual tree shrew or rat. It's actually just looking for that fecal matter. It's looking for that nitrogen to be able to help them grow. So it's this amazing niche thing that has happened that has been beautiful for both species. Now, Nymphales Hempsala is another type of pitcher plant that is higher up in the trees, and this one has developed another amazing mutualistic relationship with Hardwick's woolly bat. It has developed not only that with how it's shaped, that when the echolocation is coming back from the bat, that it responds back in a very distinctive echolocation coming back so that the bat recognizes that it's there. It has also developed like a specific type of perch so that it will crawl inside the pitcher plant, hang itself inside there in a climate controlled, cooled, insect-free pitcher plant. And again, this pitcher plant is looking for that amazing guano that comes from these woolly bats to be able to survive. And this is a major part of their plants, nitrogen. In fact, I was seeing in one of my references that 33.8% of the total nitrogen comes from these bat droppings. So thus having this amazing thing where the bat gets some protection during the day, a place to sleep, way away from everything, and the plant is getting that much needed nitrogen so that it can continue to grow. It's an amazing mutualistic relationship back and forth. But why do I bring up these pitcher plants with these texts this week? The conversion story of Paul, Jesus telling them to feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. What does this all mean? I see this much like the Revelation text that we all are part of like this choir, and we all have our different roles and responsibilities that we are being called into. Like the Paul story, that yes, sometimes people are going to question it, but there is specific callings that even times when people don't necessarily look qualified. And yet from that, something beautiful can happen. These pitcher plants were trying to take difficult soil situations or weird situations and trying to grow. So what happens? They evolve to work with two totally different mammals to figure out ways that they can grow and still benefit their ecosystem at large. Being able to be a part of something much greater than themselves. Being able to fulfill what they are called to do, to figure out to be part of something and filling an ecological niche, filling a place that is needed something. And I think as humans, that's what we all have this desire for. Peter going fishing, he sees the mission as done. And yet Jesus is coming and saying, no. You went through the training course. Now I have other things that I want you to do. I want you to take that experience and now go and do something with it. I want you to be able to then take this and be able to do something greater that I have called you into, the niche that I have called you into, to lead people toward me. And that's part of life, I think, for us, is finding that niche or niches. It's because sometimes it's for a season, sometimes for a period of time. You have to imagine it's not the same bat, it's not the same tree shrew every day that's coming in. For a period of time, yes. But at some point, there'll be a change. And I think that's, for us, it's where is our niche? Where do we fill in? I know right now there's been someone who I have been interacting with back and forth that's one of the questions that we have been talking about, is the aspect of how things that they have been doing for decades at this point is changing. They are seeing that there needs to be a change. And now what? Now what do I do? I think that's where, when we think about these carnivorous plants, they evolved into something totally different. And now they're dependent on nitrogen coming from mammals. Who would have thunk? When you think about the scheme of plants on the planet, that they were going to go direct to the source to get their nitrogen like that. That is not the typical way of doing it. And then even within the carnivorous plants, they're doing it differently, where it's like, we're not going to kill, our goal isn't to kill the victim. We're just wanting their waste, quite literally. And hopefully they can keep eating so we can keep feeding on their waste, and both benefit. I think that's at times what God is wanting us to be, to find those niches where we're able to benefit others in some form or fashion, and that they are able to come back and benefit us in the same way. And I think, honestly, it's something that we have to keep evaluating as individuals, as organizations, as churches, making sure that we are accomplishing those goals, not just for certain groups of people, but for everyone. And I think that can be really hard. So the question I have for you this week is, what is your niche? What is your niche? Where do you see yourself at this moment fitting in? I know for myself, it's been a crazy almost year when I left ministry as my day job and decided that, no, I was going to continue doing this. I'd done this podcast before I went into public ministry for my day job, and I was going to continue doing it after. But there was also like leaps of faith that I had to do, and there's been a lot of reinventing myself and redefining myself, and that's been hard. It's not been easy. There has been times where I've questioned things, and there's still times that I do. But where I've landed, I've been really happy, and I feel like I have learned and grown, and I'm seeing where I am able to more and more fit the niche of where I'm at. I've also seen with changing my job and changing what my life looks like, there's different niches now off the clock that I can get into. Different hobbies, different interests, things that are benefiting other people. There's whole vast different things because I changed one simple thing. And I was very, very scared about changing that. Even though for me in the place that I was in, I was recognizing that I needed to make that change. I was really scared. I had struggled, and we've talked about, if you listen back to some of my early podcasts, I had really struggled with job stuff. And so walking away from something to move into something different, and especially that at that point I didn't know what I was walking into, was hard. But I also see the benefits now of the niches where I've gotten to be. And even from afar, looking at where I was and seeing how God continues to work in that place of worship that I worked at, and continuing to see how God is working there as well. I think sometimes we need that type of realization within ourselves, recognizing that God has niches for us to go and fulfill, and we just need to listen. And sometimes that's a hard thing. But yet, when we go and we sit down and we eat with Jesus, and Jesus gives us these messages, tend my sheep, feed my sheep, tend my lambs, follow me, and I'll show you how to do that. Walk with me for a little while. We'll figure this out. I think that's what we need more of. We need to be able to grasp that more, harness that more, and recognize that just because we're stepping out into something new doesn't mean that it isn't stepping into exactly the place that God's wanting us to be part of the choir, to be part of an ecological niche, to go and be able to share God's news with a different group of people in a way that God only knows at that moment how amazing that's going to be. So we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.